What happens to a man when the last voice he loves goes silent? Walter Haines, a widowed carpenter, lived alone on the edge of Pine Hollow Forest, just the ticking of clocks and an empty chair where his wife once sat. Until one spring night, he discovered a massive creature, wounded, hiding in his abandoned stable. Strangely, he wasn't afraid. He just felt compassion. Quietly, he dressed the wound using his late wife's old cloth and walked away. The next morning, the creature was gone, but the porch had been cleaned, and the wood Walter had left unfinished was carved perfectly smooth. This isn't folklore. It's a story that has quietly moved across creative communities, leaving thousands in tears. If you stay with me until the end, you'll understand how a lonely man and a wild being began healing each other, wordlessly. Why sometimes silence is the most powerful way to say, "I see you," and what makes this final goodbye one of the most beautiful you'll ever hear. His granddaughter named the creature the Gentle Giant. And when a storm hit, that same giant saved Walter's life, leaving behind only a wet handprint on the wooden porch, as if to say, "Stay." If this story found you today, maybe it's meant to. Where are you watching from? Could this story travel from our tiny screen into the hearts of people around the world? If it touched you, like it touched Walter, send a wave back, like, subscribe, and help us build a quiet little corner on the internet for those who still believe in kindness, in connection, and in Bigfoot. We're here, and we see you. At the farthest edge of Pine Hollow, where the road forgets to go any further and the forest begins to breathe on its own, there sat a weathered house, not quite abandoned, not quite alive. The windows had a way of catching light but never reflecting it. The porch creaked like it remembered every bootstep that ever touched it, and the mailbox leaned, as if even the letters had stopped visiting long ago. Inside that house, Walter Haines lived the way fog settles after rain, slowly, without fuss, and in no hurry to lift. 3 years had gone by since May passed, and each one folded into the next like identical pages in a calendar he no longer bothered to turn. Every morning began the same. The kettle hissed. The old mug, chipped at the lip, waited beside yesterday's newspaper. A chair sat across from him at the table, always empty, but never moved. He'd talk sometimes, mostly to himself, sometimes to the silence, and the silence, for all its weight, never talked back. Walter didn't ask for much. He kept the path to the woods clear, even if no one walked it. He still fixed the fence, even though the horses were long gone. And each night, before locking up, he would glance out the back window into the pines, as if expecting someone who never arrived. That March evening, something shifted. The wind had been restless all afternoon, but it wasn't until just past midnight that it made its entrance known. A sudden gust, sharp as a breath held too long, flung the back door wide open. The slam rattled the frame. Walter flinched, steadying himself on the arm of the couch, then reached for the flashlight he kept near the wood stove. He stepped outside, barefoot on the porch, the boards cold beneath his feet. Out there, the woods whispered differently. Not the usual rustle or sway, but something quieter, heavier. The beam of his flashlight cut through the damp air and landed on the yard. The ground was soft from last week's rain. A long trail of pressed-down grass curved away from the steps and led to the collapsed horse shelter. Walter followed the line with his light, breath fogging with each exhale, until the beam caught a shape that didn't belong. Something was there, crouched, hunched low, shoulders trembling slightly, one knee down like it had just collapsed into itself. At first, Walter thought it might be a wounded deer, but then it exhaled, a sound too deep for any animal he knew. He squinted, steadied the light, and saw it clearer. Not a bear, not a man, something in between. Its leg was wrapped in strips of wet moss and smeared with thick mud, crudely tied with long reeds, a rough attempt at stopping the bleeding. The ankle looked twisted. The breathing was labored, wheezing with effort, and there was a scent in the air, sharp, earthy, and faintly metallic. Walter didn't move. He just watched. And the creature, for all its mass and shadow, didn't run. He should have felt fear, something primal. But he didn't. Instead, what rose in him was something stranger, recognition, like seeing another lost thing in the mirror. Slowly, without speaking, Walter turned and stepped back into the house. He returned moments later with an old wool blanket, the green one May used to keep by the back door in winter. He held it up, pausing a moment as if to ask permission, then walked toward the figure. It didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't move. When he reached it, he knelt, knees cracking, and draped the blanket gently over its back. The fur underneath was damp and matted, warmer than he expected. He didn't linger. He didn't ask anything. He just stood, gave one last glance, and walked back to the porch. The door closed softly this time. Inside, the house felt heavier. He made tea, though he didn't finish it. The chair across from him remained empty, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, as if expecting the shape of something to pass through the dark. Hours rolled by. Sleep didn't come. Around 3 a.m, just when the silence had started to feel like itself again, a sound rose from the porch, low, deep, almost a vibration more than a noise. Not a growl, not a threat. It was soft, like a hum from a chest too large to belong to any man. Walter held his breath. It didn't repeat. He waited until dawn. When the first light cut through the pine needles and painted the edges of the yard gold, he stepped back outside. The blanket was gone. The grass was pressed flat where something heavy had lain. The trail of bent foliage continued past the trees, curving deeper into the woods. He knelt, touched the ground where the creature had rested. It was still warm, not by much, but enough. He stayed there a while, crouched in his robe and boots, arms crossed against the chill. He wasn't looking for anything. He just needed to be where the silence had been broken. Later that morning, he boiled water for coffee, though the taste felt thinner than usual. The newspaper sat unopened. The chair across from him hadn't moved, but now it felt like it had heard something too. Something old, something alive. For the rest of that day, Walter kept finding himself standing at windows, listening. The wind didn't knock again. No more footsteps in the grass. But every time he looked out into the trees, the emptiness no longer looked quite the same. It held a shape now, a pause, like a sentence left unfinished. That night he didn't lock the back door. He left it cracked open, just enough for air, just enough for something to return if it needed to. And before he went to bed, he folded the wool blanket and placed it by the door. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he walked away. Somewhere deep in the trees, an owl called once, then went quiet. And for the first time in a long time, Walter didn't feel alone. Not exactly. Something had been seen. Something had spoken. Not in words, but in the way only those who've carried grief long enough know how to hear. He lay in bed, eyes tracing the dark lines on the ceiling. He listened for the wind, for the door, for the voice that had no language. And though nothing came, the silence felt changed. Not empty, not full, but shared. And that was enough to keep his eyes open a little longer. Enough to wonder if, maybe, his loneliness had knocked on a door deeper in the woods. And maybe, just maybe, someone had answered. The morning came gray and slow, like the house itself wasn't sure if it wanted to wake. The pines stood still, mist curling low around their trunks, and Walter Haines opened the back door with the same half-aware movement he did every day, expecting dew on the step and nothing more. But his boot paused mid-step, just to the right of the mat, sitting clean and precise against the wood grain, was a piece of pine. Not just a fallen branch or a snapped-off scrap, but a flat sliver of wood, shaved and sanded at the edges. Its surface was smooth, clean, a faint notch near the corner, almost decorative. Walter's throat caught before his breath could. He bent down, lifted the piece with both hands like it might vanish if handled too fast. The grain had been followed carefully. It was the same piece he'd been trying to carve down the afternoon before, out in the shed, before his hands started shaking and he set it aside in frustration. It hadn't been like that when he left it, not even close. He stood in the doorway a long time, staring out at the tree line. No wind moved the needles, no bird called. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He said nothing. He didn't call out. He just carried the wood back inside and laid it down on the counter, fingers brushing its surface once more before letting it go. There was a quiet inside him, different than before. Not the kind that came from absence, but the kind that felt like someone else was listening too. That evening he cooked extra oatmeal. Not fancy, just oats, cinnamon, a little salt, and a spoon of the good honey May used to hide behind the flour. He scooped a warm bowl full and carried it to the porch. Steam rose as he set it down on the top step. He didn't say a word, just stood there a while, arms folded, watching the edge of the woods where the light got thick and blue. Then he went back inside, left the porch light off, ate his own dinner in the kitchen, the curtain drawn back just enough. The bowl stayed untouched, but sometime after the radio clicked on by itself, maybe from the timer he'd forgotten to cancel, or maybe not, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. A shifting shadow, large and slow, passed beyond the window. Not creeping, not crouching, just standing. Walter didn't move. His spoon hovered above the bowl. The shadow lingered on the other side of the glass, far enough to stay hidden in the dark, but close enough for presence to be undeniable. A heavy pause passed between them, thick with something unsaid. Then the figure shifted and faded back into the trees. When Walter stepped outside minutes later, the oatmeal still sat there, not spilled, not sniffed, not touched, just witnessed. From that night on, he started sweeping the porch every evening. He'd brush the dust and pine needles off the boards like he was tidying for a neighbor who never knocked. Sometimes he'd hum while doing it, low and aimless, just to keep the silence soft. He started folding an extra blanket near the door. Not the wool one this time, but a lighter throw, the kind he would have offered a guest staying too late on a cold night. He didn't tell himself why he did it. He just did. That part of him that once spoke in logic now answered to something quieter. Days slipped by. A robin built a nest on the porch rail. The radio came on earlier and stayed on longer. Walter found himself talking aloud again, not in full conversations, just soft lines here and there as he moved about the house. The kind of phrases folks murmur when they think no one's around. The stove got used more. The tools in the shed were wiped clean and oiled. But he still couldn't sleep like he used to. Not out of worry. More out of anticipation, like something important was happening in the background of his life and he didn't want to miss it. Then came the morning he opened the front door and found the second offering. It lay nestled against the step, right where his boots usually landed. A small bunch of grass, not just picked and tossed, but twisted carefully into a sort of spiral. It looked like a braid, made with fingers too large for that kind of work, but done with more patience than any man Walter had known. The ends were tucked in. No twine, no knot. Just grass twisted around itself, sturdy and silent. There was no note, no trace of who had left it. The ground was dry. The breeze was still. Walter knelt, picked it up gently, turning it over once in his hands. His throat tightened, but not with fear, not even surprise. What he felt was touched. The word embarrassed him when it passed through his mind, but it stayed anyway. He placed the braid on the windowsill in the kitchen, above the sink, where the light hit it in the afternoon. Didn't explain it, didn't move it again. It became part of the house, another quiet presence, like the coffee mug that was never washed but always used, like the picture of May that he never dusted, just looked at. Later that week, without even thinking about it, he reached up and switched on the radio. It hadn't played for over a year. The same old station. Low voices between country songs, a baseball game somewhere out west. Music faded in and out like it had to travel too far to get here. He let it play, let it mix with the wind in the chimney and the creak of the old beams in the ceiling. The house didn't feel full. Not quite, but it no longer felt like it echoed when he walked. He started setting out a piece of bread in the evenings, sometimes fruit. Nothing fancy. Not because he thought it would be eaten. Not really. Just because it felt like the right thing to do. Like setting out a plate for someone who might stop by, even if they never did. Some nights, the food disappeared. Other nights, it remained. Sometimes untouched. Sometimes just slightly moved. Once, he found a single long hair near the edge of the porch, dark as river rock, fine and almost shimmering under the dawn light. He never said anything about it. One evening, while trimming a vine that had curled around the railing, he whispered into the woods, soft as a breath, "Thanks for listening." The leaves rustled once, nothing else. By mid-spring, the house felt different. Not louder, just less hollow, as if someone had taken the silence and filled it with something alive. The woods, too, felt changed, like they knew his name now, or at least his shape. He didn't go looking, didn't wander into the trees with a flashlight. He just stayed where he was. Left the door unlocked a little longer each night, sat outside later into the evening, read aloud sometimes, old pieces from May's books, poems he didn't always understand but knew she loved, words drifting into the dusk like threads someone might catch and carry home. The third gift came at the edge of a storm. Walter had just pulled in the chairs from the porch when he noticed something leaning against the wall by the door. A curved stick, polished smooth on one side, bent just enough to look intentional. He ran his thumb along it. There were tiny etchings near the base. Not words, not symbols, just marks, like notches or tallies, done with something sharp but slow. He brought it inside, laid it beside the braided grass. They didn't match, not exactly, but they belonged together, like pieces in a language only shared between two people too tired to speak. That night, he dreamed of footsteps outside, heavy, deliberate, a breath at the door, a pause, then retreating steps. When he woke, he wasn't afraid. He just sat up in the dark, blinked a while, then got up and made tea. The house held its breath, and somewhere between the floorboards and the pines, something waited with him. Not for anything to happen, not for anything to end, just waited. Like a friend who doesn't knock, one who stands just far enough away so you never have to say goodbye. Summer rolled in quietly, slipping its warmth through the seams of the old house like a guest that didn't knock. The pines thickened with green, and the air grew slower, sweeter, as if even the wind had grown tired of rushing. Walter Haines felt it in his bones. The mornings lasted longer. The sunlight lingered at his window with a soft gold that almost reminded him of her. He found himself leaving the screen door open more often, letting the breeze slip past the curtains, letting it carry the smell of pine sap and damp soil into the kitchen. Something about the air felt kinder. He'd wake earlier now, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see how the light spread across the floorboards before the day began its rhythm. His world had always been small, especially in the years since May passed, but lately it felt less empty and more intentional. He started working on the garden again. The little patch by the shed had gone wild with weeds and stubborn roots, but under the overgrowth, the soil was still good. He turned it over slowly, careful with his back, pulling out remnants of what May had once planted. Chives, some lavender, a few carrots that had turned to wood. He didn't talk much while he worked. Just breathed, felt the weight of the earth in his palms and the sun on his neck. There was a quiet kind of healing in it. Like time wasn't rushing him anymore. Like he could finally afford to go slow. Each morning, he left a small piece of bread on the porch. Just a crust or corner, whatever was left from breakfast. He never saw who took it, but the bread was always gone by midday. Once or twice, the plate was nudged slightly, not by wind, not by raccoon paws. Just moved. A soft nudge, as if it had been looked at first, considered, then taken. He never asked for more than that. One afternoon, around the hour where the shadows start growing longer and everything seems to glow in amber, Walter sat on the bench under the oak tree near the side fence. It was a spot May had loved. She used to read there, legs curled under her, a glass of iced tea sweating beside her on the stone. Now it was his place to think. He talked there sometimes, not in full sentences, just small things, half-memories, fragments of conversation. That day, he found himself talking about James, their boy. He spoke the name softly, as if the wind might get nervous and carry it away. James had been gone a long time, a car wreck in Georgia, 26 years old. And yet, sometimes, Walter still caught himself reaching for the phone. Sometimes he swore he heard the back door open the way it used to when James came home late from the shop. That day, he found himself saying it aloud, voice catching somewhere between anger and ache. "You should have stayed. You had more time." He didn't expect an answer, of course not. But in the stillness that followed, he felt a presence behind him. Not heavy, not alarming, just there. Like the kind of feeling you get when someone stands behind you in a grocery line, too close, but quieter, warmer. Before he could turn, he felt something. Not quite a hand, not quite a push. Tug gently at his shoulder, the fabric of his shirt catching just slightly. He turned slowly. No one. Just the hush of leaves above and the slant of light through the branches. But he wasn't startled. He let out a shaky breath, then chuckled, low and hoarse. "All right," he muttered. "I'll sit back down." And he did. That night brought thunder in the distance. A warm storm, slow to build, but full of warning. Clouds rolled in over Pine Hollow like ink spreading through water. By dusk, the sky had turned a deep steel, and the first droplets tapped the roof like fingers testing a door. Walter lit the lanterns before the power had a chance to cut. He knew the routine. He laid towels along the window sills where the frame warped in spring, tucked a flashlight under his arm. Then, almost without thinking, he stepped out onto the porch to check the line of the old oak near the front. Wind had already started to roar in the treetops, a sound like the whole forest taking a deep breath. Then, a crack, sharp and sudden. A groan followed by a thunderous crash. The old tree out front had finally given up. It landed with a kind of violence Walter could feel in his teeth. The ground shook beneath him. He staggered, tried to back away, but his boot caught the step, and he went down hard. Pain shot through his ribs. He tasted blood. He lay there in the rain, blinking against the downpour. Light from his flashlight spun across the yard, then blinked out. The wind howled through the branches. In the chaos, he heard another sound. Metal. Clanging. Not the roof, not the gate. Something deeper in the woods. A hard rattle like two steel bars slamming together. He knew that sound. A trap. One of the old spring jaws. No longer legal, but still hidden by men who didn't ask permission to take from the land. Then came the sound that stopped his breath. A guttural cry, raw and low. Not human, but not wild either. It wasn't pain. It wasn't rage. It was a warning. A sound that felt shaped by intention, followed by silence. Walter tried to sit up. His ribs screamed. He rolled to his side, fought the spinning in his head, and tried to stand. Another cry rang out, this time closer. Lightning cracked above the treetops, illuminating the edge of the woods like a camera flash. And in that flash, he saw two things. First, the glint of a trap, half hidden beneath wet leaves, teeth clenched around something thick and dark. Hair, not fur. Second, the form beside it. Towering, broad-shouldered, breathing like a freight train in the dark. The bear, but it wasn't the one in the trap. No, this one moved with fury, not pain. It had picked up the scent, maybe the blood. Its teeth caught the light. It advanced slow, steps deliberate, not charging but testing. Walter froze. Then everything happened at once. Another shadow, larger still, lunged from the dark. Not toward Walter, toward the bear. But not with violence. It didn't roar, it didn't strike. It moved between them, and the bear stopped, snorted, pawed the ground once, then backed away, eyes uncertain. It turned and lumbered off into the trees, vanishing as fast as it had appeared. Walter collapsed back into the mud, gasping. The shape turned to him. It moved closer. He couldn't speak, could barely breathe. A massive hand, not paw, pressed gently against his chest. Not hard, just enough to keep him grounded. To say, "Stay down, you're safe." Then blackness. When he woke, it was morning. He lay on the porch, tucked beneath an old tarp, his ribs aching but no longer screaming. The sky above him was clear. The storm had passed. He sat up slowly, the world swimming for a moment. On the top step, in the faint outline of dried rain, was the shape of a handprint, large, spread wide, and beneath it, the streak of wet dirt drawn toward the woods, like a signpost. "Go home, old man. You made it through." He reached out, touched the edge of the mark. The wood still felt warm, and in that stillness, that breath between storms, he smiled. Just barely, but it held. Autumn came like an exhale, brushing its golden fingers across the ridge of Pine Hollow and softening everything it touched. The trees turned first, slowly at first, then all at once, spilling their amber and rust across the back acres like a memory that wouldn't sit still. The air grew quieter, more brittle, like the world had lowered its voice. Leaves gathered at the porch steps, dry and weightless, whispering with every footfall. Walter Haines stood at the window one morning, watching them swirl. His hands rested on the sill, and in the low sun his knuckles looked older than usual, like they'd been carved from the same wood as the porch rail. The quiet had changed again, not empty, not aching, just waiting, as if something was due to arrive. And it did. It was Nora's voice that broke the stillness, calling from the gravel turn-in where the mailboxes leaned like tired old men. Walter stepped outside in time to see the car door slam and little feet hit the dirt road. Millie was 10 now, legs too long for her old overalls, face caught in that space between a girl and a shadow of the woman she'd one day become. She ran toward him with a crooked backpack bouncing behind her and her ponytail flying like it had something to say. Nora followed behind with the calm slowness of a daughter who's returned not out of worry, but something harder to name. A need, maybe, to reconnect the last thread between the house she was raised in and the life she built without it. Walter opened his arms before she reached him. Millie didn't hesitate. She buried her face in the flannel of his shirt and said, muffled, "Mom says there's a spider the size of a pancake in the outhouse." "Your mother exaggerates," he replied. "More like a silver dollar." Millie giggled against his chest, and Nora, arms folded, gave him that sideways smile that only daughters can give, equal parts teasing, knowing, and quietly grateful. He led them inside, the screen door groaning like it remembered them too. The house had been scrubbed a little extra the night before. Not polished. Walter wasn't one for show, but swept, ordered. A blanket folded just so on the couch. A bowl of apples he didn't buy sitting neat on the counter. That first night, they sat by the fireplace after supper, plates scraped clean of roasted squash and baked trout. Walter told Millie the same story he used to tell Nora. About the fox who stole socks from the clothesline and built a bed out of them. Millie leaned forward like she could picture every stitch. Her eyes kept flicking toward the windows, though, especially when the wind picked up. Finally, as the fire crackled into its last breath, she leaned into Walter's side and whispered, "Is it true there's a giant living in your woods?" He looked down at her, trying not to show how carefully he chose his words. "Not the kind from books," he said softly. "But maybe someone who watches." Millie frowned. "Does he eat kids?" "No," Walter smiled. "But he might eat your apples if you leave them out." That got a giggle. She didn't ask again, but the next morning after pancakes and syrup, she stepped outside with a red apple in both hands. She bit one, set it on the porch step, and turned back inside without a word. Later, when Walter walked out to check the sky for rain, he stopped short. The apple was still there, untouched, but something about it looked different. It was dry, clean. Not even dew clung to it, like someone had watched over it all night to keep it safe. He crouched beside it and noticed the faintest indent in the step beside it. Not a footprint, more like a suggestion of one. Millie noticed too. She came out with her notebook and a crayon, crouched beside the apple, and started drawing what she saw. "He liked it," she said matter-of-factly, "but he wanted me to have it back." Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. That evening, as dusk pressed in like it had somewhere to be, Millie asked if they could read outside. Walter carried a folding chair onto the porch and sat with her as she read from one of May's old books. Nora watched from the screen door, arms crossed, trying not to smile. Then, just as the light started to vanish, Millie looked up, her eyes wide. "There's something out there." Walter followed her gaze. Beyond the tree line, where the fog began to snake between trunks, a silhouette stood. Tall, still, like someone waiting their turn to speak. The figure didn't move, didn't lean forward, just watched. The shape of it was unmistakable, broad and calm, arms hanging low at the sides, a slope to the shoulders that wasn't threatening but old. Like the weight it carried wasn't new. Nora stepped beside her father, instinct already tightening her chest. But Walter lifted one hand gently. "Wait," he murmured. They all stood there, silent, watching the figure. And then, after what felt like a full minute, it turned and stepped back into the mist. Gone in 3 strides. Just as it vanished, something caught the porch light. A glint, low to the ground. Walter stepped forward and found it, a braid of grass, finer than the one before. This one tied into a loop, the ends curled inward with care. He held it up. Millie reached for it slowly, eyes still wide. "He's real," she whispered. "The gentle giant." Walter nodded once. That's what May would have called him too. And from that night on, that's how Millie spoke of him, not with fear, but with awe. Like a character from a bedtime story she now knew lived in real dirt and breathed real air. That night, she didn't ask for the nightlight. She curled under the quilt and said, "He knows I'm not scared anymore." And Walter, sitting beside her, brushing the hair from her forehead, believed her. The days that followed felt wrapped in something sacred, not loud, not sudden, just warmer, as if the air itself had been watching and approved. Nora didn't ask too many questions. She noticed small things, the wood pile stacked neater than Walter's back could have managed, the tools in the shed reorganized. Once, she found a string of pine cones laid in a straight line across the edge of the porch railing, perfectly spaced, each one hollowed in the same way. When she asked Walter, he just shrugged. "They're not hurting anything," he said. She wanted to argue. Instead, she picked one up, turned it over in her hands, and placed it back exactly where it had been. In the early hours of their last morning, Millie sat quietly on the porch, legs swinging. The fog was thick, clinging to the trees like a secret. She didn't say anything, just listened. Then, suddenly, she stood, walked to the edge of the step, and whispered into the mist, "Thank you for not being scary." No one answered, but the leaves rustled once, in a way the wind alone couldn't explain, and when Walter walked her back inside, the apple from 3 days ago had vanished. No bite marks, no trace, just the mark of something watching over what mattered most, and the porch felt a little fuller for it. Under a sky gone silver with the coming storm, Pine Hollow held its breath. The pines stood stiff, their tips rattling like bones before the first crack of thunder. Clouds had rolled in low and fast over the course of the morning, dragging with them that strange, waiting stillness, the kind that settled in the gut long before the rain arrived. Walter Haines stood at the back window, mug forgotten in his hand, watching the tree line disappear inch by inch into fog. The air smelled of iron and moss and something else he couldn't quite name. Something off. By late afternoon, the wind had started to talk. It whistled through the gaps in the porch rail, made the old wind chime rattle like teeth. Walter moved slower than usual, not because he was tired, but because he didn't like the feeling growing in his chest. Something sharp, something close to dread, but more urgent, restless. It had started the night before. A bad dream, the kind that stays stuck to your ribs long after you wake. In it, the woods were screaming. Not loud, not with voices, but through shapes and flashing eyes and a deep grinding sound, like metal scraping bone. When he woke, the house felt colder than it should have. He'd gotten up before dawn, checked the windows, the doors, even the shed. Everything was where it should be, but the feeling hadn't left. If anything, it had gotten worse. By dusk, the trees beyond the fence were bowing sideways, and the sky had gone dark as wet ash. Walter lit the kerosene lamps, set the flashlight by the door. Then, just before the rain hit, he heard it. A clang, sharp and fast, from deep in the woods. Then again, louder, steel hitting steel, not random, not wind. His heart kicked hard in his chest. He grabbed the lantern, slipped on his coat, and stepped into the storm. The rain came down in sheets, cold and sudden, like a river dropped from the sky. The light from the house vanished behind him in seconds. Each step into the forest pulled the ground from under him. Mud sucked at his boots, branches lashed at his arms. He kept going, drawn not by reason but instinct. Something was out there, something that needed to be found. Then came the sound. A cry. Not human, not animal. Low and rasping, full of pain. Walter stopped. His breath fogged in the air. His hands shook from more than cold. He swung the light wide and caught it, a glint in the underbrush. Metal teeth clamped tight around something thick and dark. A trap. The kind he thought no one used anymore. Rusted at the hinges, but still cruel. And caught in it, fur. Long, coarse, dark as soaked earth. But the shape beside it wasn't what he expected. A bear stood just beyond the trap, eyes wide and shoulders rolling with slow fury. Its snout wrinkled, ears pinned. Not attacking, not yet, but close. It paced in place, drawn to the scent of blood and meat. Its head snapped toward Walter, who stumbled backward, lantern swinging wildly. The bear took one step forward, and that's when the forest moved. A shape emerged from the dark, taller than Walter, broader than any man. It moved between him and the bear in one smooth motion, no roar, no warning, just presence. The bear reared, swiped once at the air, then turned and bolted into the brush with a crashing panic that shook the trunks. Walter dropped to one knee, chest heaving. The lantern slipped from his fingers and went out in the mud. Darkness swallowed everything. He reached for his chest. His heart pounded behind his ribs, thudding out a rhythm that didn't match the world around him. But he wasn't alone. The shape was still there, standing close enough that Walter could hear it breathing. Slow, steady, deep. He didn't look up. Couldn't. Instead, he closed his eyes and waited for the rain to finish what time hadn't. But the hand that touched him didn't hurt. It pressed gently to his shoulder, firm but careful, then slid to his ribs, where the pain screamed loudest. Walter groaned. He felt something lift him, arm strong and careful, not rushed. He was carried, not far, just enough to get out of the mud, out of the path. He was set down with his back against a tree, his coat pulled tighter around him. The last thing he saw before his eyes shut again was the outline of the trap. Sprung now, empty, and beside it, a smudge of fur and blood. When morning came, the rain had stopped. Walter woke on the porch, chest wrapped in an old blanket that didn't belong to him. The house behind him stood still, quiet. His hands were cold, but his body wasn't. Someone, something, had kept him breathing through the worst of it. He sat up slow, groaning, then froze. On the top step, clear as print in wet concrete, was a handprint. Not human, larger, wider. Fingers thick and slightly uneven, as though shaped by time. Not tools. It pointed toward the woods. Not a warning, an invitation, or maybe a message. Walter reached out and touched it. The wood beneath was dry now, but the impression remained. A mark of care, not fear. A sign that someone had stood between him and whatever was waiting in that storm. He didn't speak, just sat there in the hush that follows survival and let the silence settle around him like a blanket of its own. Inside, the fire hadn't gone out. He didn't remember lighting it. And in the kitchen, a bowl of water sat clean and full, as if someone had thought to make him drink when he couldn't stand. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it didn't sound angry anymore. Just alive. It took a full week for Walter's ribs to stop aching when he stood too fast. He still moved like a man who knew pain had memory. But the bruises faded, the color left his skin, and breath came easier with each morning. The house, though, didn't slow down to match his recovery. Something in it had shifted. The walls felt like they were listening now. Not watching, not looming. Just quietly aware. Even when no one else was around, Walter could feel the difference. As if his fall, the storm, the handprint on the porch, had broken something open between him and whatever lived beneath the pines. Nora stayed longer than she planned. She said it was to help him recover, to keep an eye on his heart, which had gone jumpy in the nights after the storm. But Walter could tell she didn't fully believe the story he'd told her. He hadn't said much, just that something out there had kept him alive, kept the bear from finishing what the storm had started. She didn't argue, not out loud, but he saw the question in her eyes when she watched him from the hallway, like she wanted to believe him but couldn't quite figure out how to. Still, she made soup, washed the windows, trimmed back the blackberry vines that had crept over the kitchen windowsill like they thought the house belonged to them. At night, when she thought he was asleep, she wandered the porch and stared into the woods with her arms crossed tight against the wind. And the little things kept happening. On the second night, the broom she'd leaned against the wall after sweeping was suddenly propped upright in the corner of the porch, bristles clean. Walter hadn't touched it. The next morning, the firewood pile was stacked neater than either of them remembered. No dirt trail, no footprints, just stacked, cleaner than any chore Walter had done in months. Nora said nothing, but she vacuumed twice that day, like she was trying to reclaim something. Then came the thing with the windows. It was small, almost nothing. A fine line in the dust on the glass of the back door, a line shaped like a palm, not pressed hard, not even deliberate, just a trace. As if someone large had leaned against the door frame and looked inside, not with hunger or fear, but with a kind of still patience. Walter saw it first and said nothing. Let Nora find it on her own. When she did, she stared for a long while, then wiped it away with her sleeve and didn't speak for the rest of the evening. By the third night, the kitchen floor had been swept without a sound, and that's when she snapped. I didn't clean that, she said flatly. standing with her hands on her hips in the middle of the room. "I know," Walter said, not looking up from his tea. She stared at him. "Then who did?" He paused. Let the steam from his cup rise and disappear between them. "Someone who doesn't want to be seen." "That's not funny, Dad." "I'm not joking." She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside without another word. He heard her boots scrape the porch. A moment later, the screen door creaked. Then silence. That night, the wind picked up again. Not a storm, not even rain. Just that low sighing through the trees that made the house feel like it was floating on the edge of something older than itself. Nora went to bed early. She didn't say goodnight, and sometime after midnight, the sound came back. A low whistle, not quite musical, moving through the rafters like it knew the house by heart. Then a soft click, like something being placed just so. In the morning, Nora stood at the kitchen table, staring at the ceiling. Her coffee sat untouched. "I took that thing down," she said quietly. Walter followed her gaze. Hanging from the center beam above the table was the same braid of pine grass she'd removed the day before, the one that had hung above the porch since Millie's visit. Only now, it hung higher than either of them could reach without a ladder. "Maybe you just forgot," Walter offered, though his voice didn't mean it. She shook her head. "No, I cut the knot and threw it in the trash." Walter said nothing, just picked up his cup and sat down like the conversation had run its course. Later that afternoon, while she went into town to pick up some groceries, Walter took the long way to the shed. His legs still ached, but he moved with purpose. He stood there, hands on the old door, and thought about how close he'd come to dying under that tree, under the weight of a storm and a bear, and a life too quiet for too long. He remembered the hand, wide, warm, careful, keeping him alive. The trap, sprung. The shape in the dark. He owed something now. Not a debt exactly, but a promise, a kind of balance. He took out a spool of twine and the remains of the cedar rope he'd once hung at the porch years ago, back when May had called it charming. He trimmed it, knotted the ends, then looped it into a circle. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. He hung it by the door before dusk, not to protect, to communicate. That night, the wind returned. It whistled through the eaves, circled the roof, rattled the glass like it had words caught in its mouth. Nora couldn't sleep. She walked the floorboards, restless. Walter stayed in his chair, facing the door, waiting for something he couldn't name. In the morning, the cedar rope was gone, replaced by a new one, thicker, tighter, cleaner, hung just above eye level. Walter stepped outside and stared up at it, lips pressed in thought. Nora joined him moments later, her arms crossed tight. "I didn't do that," she said. "I know," he replied. They stood there together, not speaking, letting the silence do the talking. Later that week, Walter overheard something in town. At the diner, just past the second cup of coffee, someone mentioned hunters, not locals, outsiders new to the region. A pair of them, walking trails they shouldn't be, laying traps where nobody looked. Walter stiffened. The waitress said she'd seen them carrying steel jaws in the back of their pickup, talking too loud about trophies. Something coiled in Walter's chest. That night, as the sun slid behind the pines and the sky turned soft with dusk, he pulled out his coat again. His breath still wheezed when he leaned too hard, but his hands were steady. He packed a small bag, flashlight, flask, knife, gauze, and laced up his boots slow, like someone getting ready for a walk that wasn't just a walk. Nora stood at the door, arms folded. "You can't go," she said. "Not with your heart." He looked up at her, eyes calm. "I have to. You don't even know where." "I know enough." She swallowed, voice low. "This isn't your responsibility." Walter buttoned the last of his coat. "It is now." And somehow she understood. Not because she agreed, but because she remembered something. Maybe from when she was a girl, or maybe from the way Millie had whispered about the gentle giant. Something in the air, in the light between the trees. Something that said, when you're seen, you're accountable. He stepped off the porch just as the first stars started to flicker. The rope above the door swayed once, slow and deliberate. And, though he didn't turn back, she stayed at the door long after he disappeared into the woods, listening. Not for his footsteps, but for something deeper, something that echoed with gratitude. The fog came down heavier than usual that morning, thick and low like a blanket wrung out over the land. It wrapped around the fence posts and drifted over the fields in quiet swirls, softening the edges of everything. Even sound had weight. The old boards beneath Walter's boots creaked quieter than usual as he stepped out onto the porch, the cedar rope swaying gently above him like a clock marking something older than time. He held nothing in his hands but a thin walking stick and a coil of worn rope tucked into his coat. He wasn't dressed for a stroll, not really. The air had a bite to it, not from cold, but from the kind of pressure that tells your bones a storm's coming, even when the sky doesn't say it yet. He didn't tell Nora he was leaving. Just left the note on the table beside the cooling coffee. Gone east, don't follow. She'd understand. Maybe not right away, but in time. There were some things you didn't explain. You just did them because the quiet between two living beings, even if one of them wasn't human, sometimes asked for more than a thank you. Sometimes it asked for your presence when the world started to shift. Pine Hollow wasn't a place for maps. Walter had walked those woods enough times in his life to know which trees leaned west in the wind, which stumps rotted fastest, which gullies held water even in the dry. But this time, he wasn't following memory. He was following signs, faint marks on bark, pressed leaves, the shape of old blood trailing where it shouldn't be. The kind of trail that wasn't left for man but could still be read by one who knew how to listen. Half an hour in, he found the first trap, snapped shut, empty, rusted at the hinges, still stained with something dark and half-dried. He crouched down slow, knees popping, and touched the ground nearby, coarse hairs, broken moss. Something big had been caught, briefly, had gotten free, maybe, or had been freed. He kept moving. Further in, the ground sloped downward into a hollow Walter hadn't visited in years. A narrow stretch of land tucked between two ridgelines, where the trees grew too close and the sun rarely touched the soil. There, in the gray light, he found the second trap. This one wasn't empty. It lay bloodied beside a thick clump of fur, the teeth of the jaw bent slightly outward. Not from human hands. Walter knelt. Something tightened in his chest. Not fear, not even grief. It was closer to knowing. The cold slap of understanding that he wasn't early. He was late. A branch snapped behind him. He turned, slowly, every muscle remembering age. Two men stepped through the fog, their silhouettes sharp and all wrong against the stillness. They moved like they owned the woods, like they knew what didn't belong here and had come to take it out. One held a shotgun. The other wore a smirk. Walter straightened but didn't speak. "Don't see too many folks this deep," the tall one said. "I live not far," Walter replied, voice steady. "You shouldn't be out here," said the second man. "It's not safe." Walter's eyes dropped to the blood on the trap. "You're the ones making it unsafe." That hung in the air a moment, heavy and sour. Then something moved beyond them. The men turned fast, weapons raised, but it didn't come at them. It stepped into view slow, deliberate, the fog clinging to its limbs like it was part of it. Broad shoulders, dark fur matted with dried blood, one arm hanging heavier than the other. But the eyes, they were steady, focused, not afraid. Walter didn't breathe. The two men froze. The one with the smirk swore softly, lowered his gun by an inch. The other raised his higher. The creature stepped between them, placing its massive frame in front of Walter, arms low, palms open slightly. A gesture that wasn't threat, but protection. It didn't roar, didn't growl, just stood. The silence screamed. Walter saw the man's finger move on the trigger. He started to speak, to shout. But then the other one, the one who'd lowered his weapon, stepped back. "I've seen it," he said, voice shaking. "Years ago, near Red Fork, it pulled my boy from the flood, saved him. I thought I dreamed it, but it was him." The gun in the other's hands twitched and jammed. He pulled the trigger. Nothing. Again, click. Then, Walter gasped. His chest seized. Legs gave. The pain came fast and deep, a spike of white-hot heat lancing through his ribs. His hands clutched his coat, knees buckled. The world tilted. He fell. He didn't hit the ground. Arms caught him. Gentle, strong. Held him like a man might hold a child, careful not to break him. The creature lifted him, turned without a sound, and walked. The two men didn't follow. Fog swallowed them whole. Walter didn't speak. He let the pain come, let the heat fade. The rhythm of footsteps soothed him, steady as a lullaby. They stopped near a tree, one Walter remembered from years ago, gnarled and split down the middle like a scar. The creature lowered him to the ground, leaned him gently against the bark. He could smell the moss, could feel the tremble of his own breath. The creature paused, then reached up, pressed one hand to Walter's chest, right over his heart. Not heart, just present. Walter looked into those amber eyes, saw a face that wasn't human, wasn't beast, but was something deeply, painfully alive. It looked back at him like it knew time was thin, like it had known this day would come. And then it turned and walked into the fog. No glance back, no sound, just gone. Walter sat there for a long time, listening to the echo of that silence. His breath returned slow. The pain dulled. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The forest was still. Above him, the rope he'd carried was gone from his pocket, but tied to a branch just above his head was a new one, fresh, braided tighter. He touched it. It was still warm. The first snow came early that year, drifting in without warning, as if the pines had called it down themselves. It fell quietly overnight, brushing the rooftops in pale silence, softening the edge of every fence post and branch until the world looked new again, even though it wasn't. Walter Haines sat by the window, watching the flakes catch in the morning light. The forest, blanketed in white, had never looked more alive. The house was warm, not the kind of warmth that came from a thermostat or a fire left too long unattended, but the kind that settles when something in you stops bracing for the worst. The wood stove crackled softly behind him. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in just enough of the dawn to turn the kitchen golden. There was bread on the table, a tin pot of coffee steeping beside a worn mug. He'd made it before sunrise, like he used to before May passed, like his body remembered what it meant to greet the day without needing a reason. He wore the pendant again. It wasn't much, just a loop of cedar rope, frayed at the edge and tied with the care of old hands. He'd rebraided it from the piece left on the branch where he'd last seen the creature, and strung it onto the leather cord May once used for her garden scissors. It hung lightly against his chest, not as a badge, not even as a keepsake, but as a reminder that something had seen him and chosen to act, and that in return, he'd done the same. He'd told Nora the full story when he returned, not all at once, but in pieces. She hadn't interrupted. She didn't ask for proof. She only listened, her eyes darting now and then to the tree line, as if the words filled in something she'd always suspected but never dared believe. Millie had listened too, perched at the table with her chin in her hands, her legs swinging, eyes wide like a sponge, soaking in everything unspoken. When Walter said the creature carried him out of the woods, that it walked away without a word or sound, Millie had only whispered, "He knew you'd come," and he had. Since then, Walter kept the house in a rhythm he hadn't known he missed. He swept the porch without needing to, mended the shutters on the west side that had banged against the wind for months. He started reading again. May's books mostly, the ones with cracked spines and underlined passages. Some afternoons he read aloud, not to anyone, but so the words could live in the air again. Sometimes he'd leave the door open a little longer in the evenings, Sometimes the porch light flickered once for no reason and steadied itself again. And then there were the footprints. Millie saw them first. It was on a Saturday, not long after Christmas. She and Nora had come up early to help with winter chores, feed the deer, salt the back steps, trim the brittle vines that crept too close to the bedroom window. They'd woken to the scent of cinnamon and the sound of the radio humming softly from the living room. The kind of morning you don't rush. It was Millie's voice that broke it. "Grandpa, come look!" Walter shuffled to the front door, coffee in hand, and saw her standing just beyond the porch steps, bundled in her blue coat, pointing at the snow. 2 sets of prints, one large, impossibly large, pressed deep into the snow like impressions from something old and heavy and soft-footed. And beside them, smaller ones, not quite child-sized, not quite adult. They walked in tandem for 20 or 30 feet, side by side, and then, just before the edge of the tree line, the smaller prints veered off gently into the brush. Walter didn't speak. He stepped down slowly, knees stiff, and crouched beside the largest track. His fingers hovered just above it, not touching, just feeling the air above it, like the memory of something still lived there. Behind him, Nora stood in the doorway, arms folded. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Millie's breath fogged in front of her. "They're walking together," she said. "Just like friends." Walter smiled. He stayed out there for a while, long after the others went back in. Snow had started falling again, light as dust, catching in the folds of his flannel. He looked out into the trees, not searching, not waiting, just open. Somewhere in that stretch of forest, someone was teaching someone else how to walk through snow. Someone older was keeping pace, letting the smaller one lead. He hadn't been forgotten. Later that day, Walter opened the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed. It hadn't been touched in months. Inside were May's scarves, her garden clippers, a few letters, and the harmonica James had left behind all those years ago. He held it in his hand a while, thumb resting on the worn brass. It didn't play anymore, but it had weight. It had memory. That evening, as the sky turned the color of ash and the pines cast long shadows across the drifts, Walter stepped out to the porch with his book and his mug and sat by the railing, wrapped in May's old shawl. Millie joined him with a blanket over her legs. Nora watched from the kitchen, one hand resting on the sink, her eyes tracing every motion like they were afraid to miss something. They didn't speak for a while, just watched the last of the daylight curl into the woods. Then Millie pointed. "Grandpa, look." He followed her gaze. At the edge of the clearing where the trees began their slow climb, a shape stood, tall, unmoving, backlit by the low sun and rimmed in silver like something from a dream. Not approaching, not retreating, just there. Walter didn't get up. He didn't wave. He just nodded once, slow and full of something deeper than words, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay one more season." Millie leaned into his side, quiet. When they went in that night, they left the porch light on, and in the morning the snow was untouched except for a single object left gently on the bottom step. A new braid of grass, wound tighter than any before, set perfectly in the center. No prints led to it. No marks led away. Only the braid, resting like a signature. Walter picked it up without a word, his hand closing gently around it. Inside the house, the fire crackled like laughter that hadn't been heard in a long while, and the silence that followed it didn't feel empty, just full of someone else breathing beside him. Sometimes the quietest stories speak the loudest, not because they shout or dazzle or race to be heard, but because they wait. They wait in the soft spaces between what's said and what's felt. They wait in the breath before the answer, in the silence between two living beings who don't speak the same language but understand the same ache. These stories don't ask to be told. They ask to be witnessed. At their heart, they remind us of something we tend to forget in the rush of modern life. That kindness doesn't need an audience, that presence is more powerful than promise, and that sometimes simply being there for someone, without question, without reward, is the greatest act of love we'll ever give. We live in a world that teaches us to explain everything, to label it, to photograph it, to prove it. But some truths aren't meant to be pinned down. Some connections aren't scientific or logical. They're sacred. They're found in the smallest gestures: a door left unlatched, a braid of grass placed gently where someone will find it, a shared glance between species who were never supposed to understand each other, but somehow do. This story, quiet, slow, and human to its core, reminds us that compassion doesn't have to roar. It just has to show up, over and over, even when no one's watching, even when there's no guarantee it'll be returned. And maybe that's what being human truly means. Not dominance, not control, but the courage to care when it's easiest to look away. In a time where we've grown so disconnected from each other, from the natural world, from the unspoken things that once grounded us, this is a call back to stillness, to reverence, to listening again. Because the world doesn't always need our voice. Sometimes it needs our silence, our humility, our hand left open just long enough for someone else to reach back. And maybe, just maybe, we don't need to be saved from loneliness. Maybe we need to be seen in it, acknowledged, accepted, loved anyway. Because there is still magic in this world. Not in fantasy, but in attention, in remembering that not everything that matters can be measured, but it can be felt, deeply. And when we meet another soul, no matter how different, with kindness instead of fear, we become something braver than we were before. Thank you for sitting with this story, for letting it unfold slowly, for feeling its quiet breath instead of needing answers. If it stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or some place, or a part of yourself you've nearly forgotten, we'd love to hear about it. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what moments stayed with you most. And if these kinds of quiet, human stories speak to your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow this channel for more. Your support helps keep these stories alive, not just on the screen, but in the spaces between all of us. Until next time, take care of each other, and leave the porch light on.